Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of All Things Policy. Today we unpack why governments, even with the best minds and the noblest intentions, so often get it wrong. I'm Vanshika Saraf, a research analyst with the Indo-Pacific Studies program, and I'm joined by Maria Ann Phillip, who is interning with us here at Takshashila. We're going to take a short trip to 10 Downing Street and discuss a book called The Blunders of Our Governments by Anthony King and Ivor Crewe. It's a landmark study of political missteps by successive British governments. We look beyond scandals and slogans to understand why sometimes the smartest policymakers end up making foolish decisions and why systems which are designed for accountability keep producing mistakes. And perhaps most importantly, what we as citizens can learn from the anatomy of these failures. So, Maria, give us a quick description of the cover of the book. I know you're fascinated by it. So, can you describe it for our listeners?
So I think the book cover is fascinating because it features a caricature style illustration that depicts four flustered politicians, each wearing a dunce cap. So a dunce cap is a pointed hat that was used as a punishment for disruptive students in Europe and the United States in the 19th and 20th centuries, mainly in schools. So on the cover, you can see caricatures of Margaret Thatcher, John Major, Tony Blair, and Gordon Brown with comic expressions on their faces. So that's why I find the cover fascinating. But Vanshika, can you now tell us about the book? Can you tell us a little bit about the authors as well? How do you think their professional standing informs the way that they look at these blunders?
This book called The Blunders of Our Governments, it basically examines major policy failures of the British government roughly from 1970s to early 2010s. The fall of Thatcher to sort of, the Brown Labour government in 2010. And it also sort of explores how major policies in the UK failed so spectacularly despite being designed by intelligent, well-intentioned individuals. So the authors sort of do an examination of 12 policy failures. They draw on extensive government documents, interviews, and they don't just describe what happened, but they also sort of analyze the flaws in the political culture of the time. Talking about their background, so both are actually political scientists. One of them is a longtime professor at the University of Essex. He also used to be a BBC political analyst, Anthony King, and he was always known for his commentary on electoral behavior, on governance. Same for Ivor Crewe. He was also a public policy scholar, and he served, as a vice chancellor at the University of Essex. So they have this sort of shared background in political science and public administration. So this sort of allows them to, approach these mistakes not as some sort of isolated mishap, but as, symptoms of a deeper dysfunction in the system. And so we get a very complete understanding of, how power, institutions, and decision making sort of interact in a modern democracy.
Cool. So I've noticed that the book title is called Blunders of Our Government and not Failures of Our Government. So what are the authors defined as a blunder and how does it differ from a general failure?
So, yeah, that's actually a very important question. So, like I said, I'm going to quote from the book here, right? So, the authors define blunder as an episode in which a government adopts a specific course of action in order to achieve some objective. But as a result, largely or wholly of its own mistake, it either fails to completely achieve those objectives or achieves some of them at a very disproportionate cost or achieves all of them but causes a significant amount of collateral damage in the form of what we call unintended consequences, right? So I think it's important. They say that a blunder is not simply a bad outcome, it's not something that was unpopular. A blunder is a very foreseeable and preventable policy problem that resulted from either institutional errors or human errors. So they are not saying that a blunder was wrongdoing. They often stem from arrogance, from what the authors call groupthink, from sort of some bureaucratic insulation. So, in that sense, this book is more about not as to, which government failed or which prime minister failed, but into why systems repeatedly allow failure. So, I think that is something very unique about this book.
Interesting. So, do you think it's fair to say that the narrative that's been woven in the book can be seen as a maiming of the policymakers themselves?
Uh, Again, so I would say no. Because, yes, on one hand, they do expose the failures of the policymakers. That is true. But none of the authors set out to ridicule them. So, the idea was to analyze sort of why well intentioned and smart actors in government consistently make mistakes that could be avoidable, right? So, it's not as much as a personal sort of indictment. It's basically how leaders they ignore warnings, they misread data, or they sort of cling to ideological sort of blinders, right? So, in that sense, I think they have transformed these case studies from failures into sort of blueprints for learning, right? Because it sort of serves civil servants and ministers to study the anatomy of the errors. So I think rather than maiming, this would be more of an autopsy, like an examination of why governance went wrong.
Right. Okay. Thanks for clarifying that. So now let's discuss some of the examples because I know the book talks about them. One such example was the ID card scheme in the UK. And do you mind telling us why it was a failure?
Yeah, so this case study is again, I think, extremely relevant and important for all policymakers. So, just some background. So, this ID card scheme was started by the Tony Blair government in around 2004. And the idea was that this card will contain biometric information like fingerprints, facial image, iris scan, and link it to a national identity register, which is like a centralized database. I know for a lot of our Indian listeners, this sounds extremely eerily similar to an ID card that we have, but we'll come to the comparison later. So, this card that the British government at the time wanted to introduce was basically in light of some of the bombings that happened. So this was to enhance national security post 9/11, post the 7/7 London bombings. And initially the card was voluntary, then later it became sort of mandatory. But there were again lot of problems because one, there was no major public demand for such a card. Second, as we know, it was perceived as sort of a violation of liberties. It had a problem among advocates of privacy, human rights, and basically people just couldn't understand what was the problem it was meant to solve that wasn't already addressed by other documents like your passport. So essentially, after about 5 to 6 years, the entire Identity Card Act was repealed. The National Identity Register was destroyed. All the biometric data that was collected was deleted. And obviously, the project costed some more than £200 million. And obviously, there was no outcome in return.
Right. So, like you did say, it sounds very similar to the other scheme in India. How do you compare it with the scheme and which we would consider a comparative success?
Yeah, so I think, see, one of the reasons, Aadhaar was always framed not as a tool of surveillance, but like as an enabler of development, right? Its aim was to improve welfare delivery, reduce sort of leakages, enhance inclusion. So I think Aadhaar emerged from a very developmental context, whereas in UK, this ID card sort of came with this security surveillance narrative. So because of that, people viewed it through like the eyes of as a remnant of Big Brother other governance. So I think this was one reason why people were very skeptical of it. And the second reason was, I think, Aadhaar in India, as you know, was created by UIDAI, which was a semi-autonomous authority. So it was insulated from direct political control, unlike the case in the UK. So I think this is a very important sort of distinction. And again, I think something that I've said was, in India, identity, has always been very directly tied to access to subsidies, to transfers, to bank accounts. But in the UK, there was no tangible benefit really from this card. So I think because of that absence of perceived utility, it was, it was easier to sort of resist that.
Right. Okay. So on a more general note, do you think intentions have something to do with the success or failure of a policy, or are the intentions behind the policy visible solely through their implementation?
So yeah, again, so I think declared intentions, sometimes differ from political intentions. So as we saw, in this case, sometimes policies are framed as this public welfare, advancement, and this serves electoral gain. It serves their image, but ultimately, people see through that. So, for example, this ID card scheme that we just discussed, it was sort of introduced under the guise of security, but I think people realize that it also reflects a growing state appetite for surveillance. So in such case, sort of policy failure became an exposure of the true intent. But having said that, I think it's very important for governments to state their intentions, because stated intentions create accountability. They allow citizens to measure performance against the original purpose. So, yeah, intentions are necessary, but they are not sufficient for success. Only implementation is where, they acquire meaning. And the more clear and transparent the intentions are, the higher the compliance and participation by the citizens as well.
Right. So while we're on the topic of intentions, another scheme that seemed well intentioned was the digitization of the NHS, stepping into a modern era. Do you think at the time the NHS just reached too far, that it forgot to account for patient confidentiality? And can you tell us a little bit about how this scheme constitutes a blunder?
Yeah, again, this is also a very interesting case study in the book, because I didn't know about it. I know about the NHS, and I'm sure most of our listeners do. But in about 2002, the Blair government, launched sort of one of the most ambitious technology projects in history. It was called the National Program for IT in the NHS, which is the National Health Service. And the goal, as we can imagine, was to, create a unified electronic system which connected hospitals, general practitioners, pharmacists, patients all across England. And this was a time where there was a lot of optimism about e-governance, and they sort of also showed their faith in technology as a solution to inefficiency. So at that point, the scale of this project was just massive. It aimed to merge data of more than 60 million patients into one standard system. But as we're talking about blunders, this policy was also a blunder, and it was scrapped after some 10 years, after too many delays and distrust. So, just to come to your point on why it was a blunder. So, I think, firstly, and this is something that's, I think, common across countries and policies, is that they completely neglected end users. So, the clinicians and the patients, the very people who were expected to use the system, they were excluded from the design and the testing stages. The doctors, nurses, they were never consulted. So basically, everyone realized that, okay, my data, rather than being protected, I think it's being commodified. So that was one reason. The second was that, again, there was an overconfidence in technology. And the view was, because technology had sort of transformed the private sector, officials thought that if it could be applied to the public sector with sort of equal ease, right? And I think the third was that, problems were evident from the very beginning, but the government kept funding the project. They were just unwilling to concede failure. So this is what we call sort of sunk cost fallacy, right? So eventually the project, it started out around 5 or 6 billion pounds. It actually exceeded 10 billion pounds. So, it just ballooned at the end. So I think these are some problems that we really need to be careful of.
Right. Thanks for that, Vanshika. Can you tell us, do you think similar patterns of blunders appear in other democracies? If yes, is there any example that comes to mind?
Oh, yeah. So I think one example that I thought of when I was reading of this book was this scheme called the Robo-Debt scheme in Australia. So it was introduced by the Australian government to use automated data matching and identify overpayments of welfare benefits. So I'll just explain. So basically, this scheme, it matched annual income data from the Australian Taxation Office with fortnightly income declarations from welfare recipients. And the idea was to identify and register if there was an overpayment of welfare benefit from the government. But what happened was, because of this, the burden of proof actually shifted to the recipient. So, if the derived average income didn't match the declared amount, a debt notice would be issued automatically. So the biggest problem with this scheme was that they ignored the fact that income could vary week to week, especially for irregular and for casual workers. And this led to a lot of false debt calculations. And the onus was on the recipients to prove that they didn't owe money, even when, the data was unavailable. So most people had no records left to defend themselves. And this caused so much financial distress, psychological distress, because people were told to pay thousands of dollars and they had no idea why. And one of the reasons why this happened was because the algorithm that they used to issue automatic debt letters, there was no oversight or verification, case by case verification. So human oversight was completely missing. And ultimately, what happened was in 2019, the Federal Court of Australia, it said this scheme is unlawful and the calculations were not based on proper evidence. In fact, what happened was the government had to cancel over 4 lakh debt notices, and it also agreed to a very high amount of class action settlement. So, I think this example also sort of warns us about over relying on technology. In fact, a royal commission was set up in about 2022, and it actually found that the public service for servants and the ministers, they knew the flaws of the system and they continued with the scheme anyway. So again, I think it's very important for policymakers to realize that, it's okay that they've invested in something, but the moment, it's not working, it is a sign of, humility to sort of not pursue it anymore and to not, to really sort of take a step back.
Right. So, based on that last note, can you tell us more about the author's takeaways from the book?
Yeah, so I think I would say mostly there are two or three takeaways from the book. So one, as I think a theme that's been recurrent is that we need to understand that any policy failure is not just about bad people or bad luck. It's often the result of flawed processes. So it's important to understand that. And I think the second key takeaway would be that you need to have consultation and pilot testing as safeguards against blunders. So again, Aadhaar, one of the reasons why it worked was we also sort of started, bottom up. We started pilot testing in rural areas, unlike, the NHS or the ID card scheme. So I think these two are, I think, very important takeaways from the book. And I think third is that policy learning is extremely cumulative. So if India, for example, can learn from, the mistakes of these countries, so we can actually improve our governance model itself.
Right. So, I have one last question for you, Vanshika. So, the book explicitly talks about the blunders of the UK government. Is there a similar book written or a study done on the blunders of the Indian government?
Yes, actually. So, there's a book called Missing in Action: Why You Should Care About Public Policy by Pranay Kathastane and Raghu Jaitley. So, I would say it's a close sort of Indian counterpart, not a direct analog to the book, but it is conceptually very adjacent because it also investigates why public policy in India very often underdelivers and how systemic factors like citizen disengagement and institutional design lead to recurring failures. So I think the book's core argument is that citizens in India are absent from the policy making process, which is why the book is also called Missing in Action. But how this absence then produces, weak accountability and allows short term incentives to dominate. So I think it's a very good diagnosis of why blunders keep happening in India, not just from poor execution, but from a disconnect. Where citizens expect too much, yet they engage too little with the design and delivery of policies.
Thanks, Vanshika. That was a great summary of the book. Lots of valuable lessons to be learned and put into practice.
Thank you, Maria.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.